In fact, the book that we read this time is largely an attack on contemporary German philosophy, to say that philosophy itself is just what you've been programmed because of your social class.
He failed to get an appointment as a professor. And I think he was like 23 when he was looking. And then he basically became a journalist. So that may be part of his disillusionment with philosophy.
Yeah, but he started out, and by the time of this book, so he wrote this when he was 26, 27. He was still engaging, at least, with the philosophical establishment, which was Hegel.
Yeah.
Hegel, and more so the young Hegelians. So in the wake of Hegel's death, there are all these people. And of course, we've done some Hegel episodes, and there are so many different directions one can go from Hegel. And Hegel wrote on so many different things and wrote so obscurely that you can come up with just completely contradictory philosophies that both call themselves Hegelian.
For our purposes and Marx's purposes, the most important and fashionable idea at the time was that ideas drive history, basically. So we remember from the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel sort of maps out this history of consciousness, you could call it, which in many ways is a history of the spirit of various different epochs. You know, at some point you get this transition, say, from Stoicism to skepticism or something like that, you know, unhappy consciousness, all these different forms of collective consciousness that Hegel characterizes. The human beings are human beings of their own times. They're shaped by this form of collective consciousness. And it has its own dynamic. In a way, the history of human beings in this sense is a history of thought, because the kinds of great ideas that philosophers have actually filter into the public discourse and social life, and lots is determined by that. And so this is part of what Marx is going to object to. I guess we should also say something about what the young Hegelians were doing with Hegel.
Yeah, so a lot of this book, which we should say, so the book itself is this giant, sprawling 2-volume thing that was submitted for publication and I guess rejected. That the publisher said, yes, you know, things have changed and we're not going to publish this. And then it's
also a repetitive, irritable, sarcastic rant. So.
Right. And a lot of it is like there's whole sections, parts that we did not read, largely that are ripping on some of these young Hegelians. So Bruno Bauer is one guy he calls Saint Bruno. And Max Stirner, Saint Max, he calls throughout here. The book as a whole is written by Marx and Engels, but at least the editor of the Marx collection that I'm reading here, Robert Tucker, I see, opined that this part that we read, which is the part that people generally read of the German ideology, is pretty much all Marx. It's elaborating the notes of this other work called Theses on Feuerbach, who's another one of the young Hegelians that he was writing at the same time, right as they kicked off this collaborative work.
We'll refer to the collective Marx and Engels as just Marx.
Right. Right. From what I hear, from what the lectures told me, Marx was the genius who came up with the original ideas anyway. Engels was actually kind of a clearer writer, clearer thinker. You know, maybe he was a good editor on this particular, a good editor, an editor on this particular work that we read, but we don't really have to worry about him. So the young Hegelians, a lot of what they were concerned with were the theological parts of Hegel. That, in fact, this absolute spirit, you were saying the phenomenology is kind of a picture of the evolution of consciousness. Well, the end point, when you take that to the philosophy of history, and we have an episode on that, if you look way back to episode 15, it's sort of the collective understanding of humanity gradually understanding itself. And that actually becomes equivalent to the creation of God, that we create God. God is existence itself coming to understand itself, so that it might start as this blind bunch of forces, but then is there a God? Well, maybe there's a Spinozic God or something to start with, or a will in the way that Schopenhauer would talk about it, or who knows. But by the end of history, you would have this full-blown personal God.
Yeah.
And so that's a crazy ass view.
And this, and the state is co-relatively evolving as well. So for Hegel, this sort of history of consciousness, of spirit, had reached its endpoint, and it reached it in the Prussian state, and philosophically it reached it in Hegel, and religiously it reached it in Christianity and Jesus. These are all the endpoints of this historical development and essentially the perfection of it. So the end of history is reached there. Yeah.
Yeah. There's another important point that is going to be a huge issue for Marx with respect to Hegel, and that's that this development of spirit's consciousness, or of consciousness, it's a movement towards freedom. and the realization of reason in spirit in the world, blah, 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 ultimately is an expression of realization of the freedom that corresponds to this development of consciousness where you come to this realization of self-consciousness. Marx obviously is going to be putting forth the thesis that we're actually moving in the other direction. That's a critical element as well.
Right, but they both share a conception of freedom that we've talked about in terms of Kant and others before, that freedom is not freedom from, it's not just being left alone, it's having sort of support in a certain way. So having a supportive society, for Marx, it comes down, I think, a lot of this to having productive interactions with others, that they're dealing with you as a whole person and not as an instrument.
Yeah, I get that. I'm not saying that they had necessarily radically different ideas of freedom. What I'm saying is that for Hegel, there's been this inexorable unidirectional march towards freedom. And what Marx is basically saying is, actually, we haven't been moving towards freedom. We've been moving quite away from that with respect to individuals being free to self-determine and self-actualize.
But I think he'll see, this progression from early communities to feudalism to capitalism and then to communism. That's a similar sort of progression to the one we see in Hegel. It's just quote unquote material. So I think with Marx will be sort of embracing Hegel's structure, but rejecting his idealism. And he's pivoting off the young Hegelians who, the young Hegelians came along and rejected or criticized the religious aspect of Hegel, and they were essentially atheists, and they criticized his abstractness and his idealism. And, one of the criticisms of the religion, for instance, is the idea of a incarnation of Jesus, as this idea of the spirit being incarnated in one individual. Marx comes along. At a certain point, he was a young Hegelian himself, and then he breaks with him. But for Marx, their criticisms don't really go far enough because they still see religion and ideas as the driving force of history. And they still see the road to emancipation as paved with the development of new ideas. But for Marx, that development actually comes from what he calls material conditions. So you can't come along and write the Communist Manifesto at the wrong time in history when the forces of production don't line up and when other material conditions don't line up properly. You're not going to produce communism simply through the propagation of ideas. The propagation of ideas is actually secondary to, or superstructure to, or you might say epiphenomenal to these material conditions.
Yeah, I say we table it, but I'll just say that where Hegel sees a kind of linear progression from a state of freedom only for the few towards freedom for the many, or freedom in itself, I think because Marx talks about the revolutionary moment, his progression is not towards, but actually it's almost like you have to go away from it and get to a point. That's kind of what I meant by that is.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, one of the conditions of revolution is that you have this tremendous amount of conflict or tension, which again, this is reflective of the Hegelian dialectic where you have to produce a contradiction to move on to the next stage.
Just one more thing on the young Hegelians. So another way of referring to the movements after Hegel that I was reading about was to break them down into the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians. So the right Hegelians would be following Hegel's conservatism, right? Hegel actually thought that the end point of this progression of spirit through history is the current Prussian state, which was a constitutional monarchy, and he was politically pretty conservative. That's where it came down at the end of his life. The young Hegelians or left Hegelians, now I don't know if they're called young because they were young or because they are followers of the young Hegel who wrote the Phenomenology rather than the old Hegel who wrote the Philosophy of Right. I'm not clear on that, but in any case, the left Hegelians were politically radical, right, as well as being atheists for the most part.
Yet they eventually became radical. I think they started out less radical. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Interpreting miracles in naturalistic terms, for instance. So some of this was even in Hegel and his own way of modifying theology, which Schleiermacher is a figure that we had an episode on who's very much in this tradition. So Hegel had already broken orthodoxy, and already we said he has this very weird notion of God. With that is an emphasis on things like reading the miracles in a naturalistic, metaphorical manner. So like one of the biggest young Hegelians was this guy named David Strauss, who wrote The Life of Jesus Critically Examined, who is a student of Schleiermacher's. It was caused a huge scandal because he characterized elements in the gospel as mythical in character. And then Bruno Bauer, one of the guys that Marx criticizes, actually is most famous for criticizing Strauss on this. Incidentally, Nietzsche was another guy that criticized Strauss and was encouraged by Bruno Bauer, one of these people that Marx hates. So I know I'm name dropping like hell, but there was a lot of philosophical concentration going on here. And this all feeds into why Marx thinks that this critique that he's giving in German ideology is necessary, because philosophy was a big freaking deal, apparently, in Germany at the time. He says, like, even sort of normal, decent citizens feel a flush of pride at this edifice of German philosophy. So I don't know that much about the history of the time, what was really going, but at least it's certainly described as if there was much more permeation of philosophy into the life of regular citizens than maybe we have today. I don't know.
The more that's at stake, apparently, the more nasty you need to be to your fellow philosophers.
Yes.
Who I think he associated with at some point.
Right. Just to throw another name from our past into here. So remember, Kierkegaard was another one who, in the wake of this Hegelianism that was dominating the church and Germany and its surrounding area at the time, reacted very violently against that in the opposite direction from Marx. That Kierkegaard was all about this personal authenticity. And that actually seems to be also what Feuerbach, who Marx talks about quite a bit in this work, Ludwig Feuerbach was another one of these young Hegelians, and Marx was very influenced by him. That's why this thesis on Feuerbach is the work right before this and written contemporaneously with this, who was somebody that had already made this move that Marx is making toward materialism. But he just didn't think that he made the move toward materialism, but didn't make the move all the way toward praxis. I thought maybe a good way to kick this off is actually to read, since this thesis on Feuerbach thing is only 11 theses over just a little over 2 pages, is to read a couple of the theses, because these kind of give in aphoristic form some of the things that are in German ideology. That sound reasonable?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So just the actual connection toward Feuerbach, this is the only one that mentions it, spread over thesis 5 and 8, is Feuerbach, not satisfied with abstract thinking, appears to sensuous contemplation, but he does not conceive sensuous as practical human sensuous activity.
Why, yes, Socrates, you could say that.
Yes. And then sort of following up a few theses later, the highest point attained by contemplative materialism, that is, materialism which does not comprehend sensuousness as practical activity, is the contemplation of single individuals in civil society. So it's still taking the route that Kierkegaard took, or somebody like this took, taking the existentialist route, which almost all these guys following Hegel were existentialists of one sort or other. Marx is entirely against that you can't actually understand human nature or the human condition or any of that as long as you're absorbed in navel gazing, as long as you're absorbed in making your own individual belief authentic and examining the psychology of the individual. It's a dead end.
Yeah, so Feuerbach, he was advocating this materialistic or humanist materialism. Is that what it was called? But he doesn't attempt to derive the course of history from economics, essentially. That's really the complaint. So he doesn't get beyond, again, this idea that philosophical and religious ideas are the driving force of history. I don't know enough about Feuerbach to know whether that's true.
I'm just trying to set up that there's, even before economics comes in, there's still this mood toward what we might call pragmatism or positivism, depending on what circles you're talking in. So one of these other theses.
Yeah, and Feuerbach has already made that.
Yep.
Already made that move.
The question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but it is a practical question. Man must prove the truth, that is, the reality and power, the this-sidedness of his thinking in practice. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking, which is isolated from practice, is a purely scholastic question. All of your griping about individual philosophic theories that are isolated from practice is a waste of freaking time.
Yeah.
It's just funny that, we were just complaining at the end of the last episode about people who take this attitude. Well, it turns out there's many points of view from which one can criticize philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I thought of Callicles, especially at a certain part of this when he really starts to go off on people. Like section 2 of 1A, production of consciousness. When he's in that tirade, it's worthy of Callicles.
And then the last thesis in here I wanted to read, and then I'll be done with this. And okay, there's 2 more.
All right.
Number 3, the materialist doctrine that men are products of circumstances and upbringing, that therefore changed men are products of other circumstances and changed upbringing, forgets that it is men who change circumstances and that it is essential to educate the educator himself. Hence, this doctrine necessarily arrives at dividing society into 2 parts, one of which is superior to society. The coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity can be conceived and rationally understood only as a revolutionizing practice. So again, you might recognize we're influenced by our society or something like that, but you have to go further than that and actually do a historical analysis that if you're talking about nature versus nurture, you're still dwelling on the individual psychology and you're not dwelling on, well, why is the nurture done that way?
Yeah. And you can call yourself a materialist and a positivist and still want to